in my book and in my talks, the second to last step of the lean product process, top of the product market fit pyramid, is UX design. I'm a big fan of, hey, before we do invest any engineering resources and code something, let's create a prototype that we can test with customers. And let's iterate on that until we get to the point where, customers love this thing. There's no complaints. Then we can very confidently go to engineering and say, build this because we validated it, right? No one's one-shotting anything good, right? The first time you do vibe coding, you're like, build an Airbnb clone, and it spins and it does it. And you're like, check it out. And but what you just built is not going to compete with Airbnb, right?
Hello and welcome to One Night in Product, a show where I chat to some of the brightest minds in product from across the globe to help you see product management in a whole new light. If that sounds up your street, don't forget to dive into the back catalogue on your favourite podcast app or on YouTube. And of course, follow, share, or drop me a comment or review. It all helps keep the lights on. Tonight, I'm delighted to welcome back my good friend and most extroverted person I know, Dan Olsen, product management trainer, consultant, author and speaker, author of 2015's The Lean Product Playbook, organiser of the Lean Product Meetup, and guaranteed to be the one talking Spanish to the restaurant owner at the end of the night, even if it's not a Spanish restaurant. These days, he's running workshops on vibe coding and trying to help PMs make sense of all this AI stuff. But is it an opportunity or a threat? Dan, thanks for coming. Welcome back.
Thanks, Jason. Always awesome to talk with you.
Well, let's not tell anyone, or they'll all be trying to do it. But, it's good to see you again. It's been a while since you've been on the podcast. Obviously, we've seen each other a couple of times since. And I do have to say that you are definitely very much that you're always the one that's talking to everyone. Like, there's this kind of cliche about friendly Americans, and then there's you. So, I just want to kind of tip my virtual hat to you're kind of flying the flag for all of us.
You mentioned I'm half Spanish too, so Spanish people can be extroverted as well. So I hope we get to have some yummy Spanish food again sometime soon.
Well, one day, you never know your luck. So, as we've kind of mentioned, it's been a bit since you've been on the podcast, but also we've not really spoken for a little bit now. So, be kind of curious before you kind of jump into it. What's kind of keeping you busy these days? What you're working on? Like, what's taking up your time? Yeah,
so I have a mix of. I've been on my own for over 20 years now, and what keeps me busy mainly is like training workshops. So private training workshop for companies. It used to be 100% product management training workshops where I would just teach my book. And then starting last summer, I started teaching vibe coding workshops, which are a lot of fun. So I do private workshops for companies. I try to do public workshops when I can. Occasionally, I have a public workshop coming up this weekend, or like if I go to speak at a conference and they have a workshop, I do it there. So really, training is the main thing. I also do some consulting and advising on the side for a few companies. As you mentioned, I run the Lean Product Meetup. This month is actually, February will be 15 years of running it every single month. So we've got quite a big community there. I also run Product Leader Summit, once a year conference. So, like a mixed bag of a lot of stuff. Try to blog and write when I can. And I love talking with people like you, when I can as well. So, yeah.
I think we these days are supposed to call it a portfolio career, right? Like we've
there you
got all
go.
These fingers in all these different pies. We're the worst product people in the world because we can't concentrate on anything. We've got to do all of the things because there's so much opportunity out there. We're like founders. We're like, really passionate founders that can't, focus on anything.
Solopreneur. I consider myself a solopreneur, right? I've had my own business for a while now. And and it's actually good. The diversity is good, because sometimes one thing's like every October is just slammed with conferences and events and things like that, right? So it's nice to have other stuff different times of year.
Absolutely. Well, so you just mentioned writing as part of what you do, and obviously you've got the book, which I've put there for you, just in shot, just in case anyone wants to go and pick it up afterwards. But also on your website as well. And one of the things, kind of to sort of segue us into this vibe coding topic that we're going to talk about tonight, you had an article on the website that I sort of picked up on recently, which kind of tickled me a little bit. This idea that there's so many people these days, so much hype around sort of AI in general, and also just whether this is the final sort of death of product management, and whether we need product managers or product management anymore, if it can all just be done by other people or agents or whatever else. And obviously, you've written a pretty decent length article on it.
Yeah,
I'd be very curious to kind of kick it off and just try and get your opinion on, like, is product management dead, or at least on its way out, or has it still got a lot, a bit of life left in the old dog yet?
Not dead yet. I'm Monty Python parrot skit. All right. And it's funny because I wrote that article a year ago. So a lot has happened in a year, right? So I wrote that article because, 18 months ago, 16 months ago, you were starting to hear people saying, oh, I don't know, with AI here, I think PM is dead, And I didn't feel like that was accurate. I mean, it's easy for anybody to make any claim. So I kind of wrote that article. The funniest thing is I think the pendulum is completely swung now, right? Or swung a fair bit, right? When AI was new, nobody really knew which jobs is it going to automate, which jobs is it going to replace. And so people were rightfully concerned, like, oh, is it going to replace my PM job or not? And I kind of thought about this in detail. I think you got to think about the skills and the jobs and what is AI good at. For example, writing marketing copy is pretty darn good. Like most people go in there trying to have it write marketing. You know, obviously you can tell sometimes it's AI, it's getting better. But the point is it can write decent copy. So if you're like, so if you were a copywriter or, kind of a marketing person whose job was to create copy on a frequent basis, if you unless you were really, really good at your job, there's a threat that it could replace you, right? So same thing with engineering, like front end coding, for example, right? If you're just writing JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and there's a bell for all these skills. There's a bell curve, basically, right? And I think that what I see it is the AI is starting at the bottom of the bell curve and it's moving its way up, right? So certainly vibe coding tools today can produce front end code that's at the quality level of, say, a 20th percentile junior developer. So you know what I mean? So that's how I think about it. Like there's a bell curve for each skill. Well, it's whether it's copywriting or front end dev or product management. And obviously product management is a collection of a lot of different skills and tasks and activities that we do. But the funny thing is, people are actually going the other way. What they're finding historically is if you think of like product development as a factory line, it's like it starts out with the business folks or the product folks coming up with the requirements and the objectives. And then ideally the design, obviously we don't want it to be waterfall and serial, they're collaborating, but then the designers sort out what's the user experience going to be. And then we pass on the developers who develop it and go out. Typically the bottleneck, any factory line has a bottleneck or any system has a throughput constraint, was always been engineering. And it was always like the mantra was make sure your backlog's full, make sure you're keeping engineering busy. That's the worst thing you can do is not have stuff for engineering to do, and if you haven't had time to do discovery, just give them some bug fixes or tech debt or something, right? That was the old mantra. Well, what you're starting to see is as engineers are using the vibe coding tools as productivity boosters, right? The above average developers, the back end developers, they're using it their productivity is increasing. And so, that was kind of my sense that PM might be more valuable. And so I was really happy when Andrew Ng, who's one of the pioneers of machine learning, he was speaking several months ago at a Y Combinator event. And he said, hey, what one trend I'm seeing with my AI startups is the traditional ratios of PM to engineers are kind of changing, right? And just a quick aside on that, these are not the end all be all, but I've found in my experience working with, hundreds of companies that you can predict a lot based on the PM to engineer ratio, right? If you have like 12 or more engineers on average for each PM, there's no way those PMs can keep up. They're Jira jockeys. They're living in Jira. They're doing the Scrum ceremonies. They have no time to do discovery or strategy or anything like that, right? And so when you get down, typically I like, 6 to 8 is kind of a healthy range. If there's more UI stuff involved, maybe it's more like 5 or 6. If there's less UI stuff involved, maybe 7, 8, whatever, Anyway, Andrew was just saying, hey, now, basically his startups were saying that now with AI helping his engineers become more productive, the bottleneck was moving upstream to product management. And therefore they wanted to have a lower ratio of engineers to PMs. And he was saying like 4-to-1, things like that. And then he closed out by saying, and just yesterday, I had a founder come and say, I want 2 PMs for every engineer. Like, so that flipped the ratio. No, and he kind of caveated that by saying, well, I don't know if that's really right, but he just shared that data point. But the point is, I think that the kind of throughput optimization and the bottleneck is changing as engineers get more efficient. And I think that if you think about the tasks and activities that product managers do, yes, some are rote tasks that might be able to be automated. But, and I think we'll get into this as we talk about vibe coding, the thinking work, the why behind it, the discovery, the data, the evidence, the forming of conclusions in light of, nothing's ever black and white. They're always making decisions under uncertainty, right? And I think that those core skills are more valued now than ever as kind of creating solutions becomes easier than deciding what should we build and why should we build this versus that becomes more important. So I think you're actually seeing for strong PMs, they're even more in demand. And with vibe coding, they're able to do more and be, in a sense, more self-sufficient or more capable, which we'll talk about. So, that being said, if you're a PM, if you're if you're like, say, a weak PM, and you're like avoiding AI like the plague, and you're like, like you're just not leaning in, then you might lose your job, right? So my biggest advice is, this is not a fad that's going to come and go. This is a fundamental change. Kind of like, it's like we were talking about, you were saying, should there even be a title AI product manager? It's like, that reminds me back in the day, it was like, there's a mobile product manager. I'm a mobile product manager. Now we don't do that anymore. It's like, yeah, of course your app needs to live in mobile and the web, right? So anyway, I think that's kind of how I see things playing out. I think the biggest factor, and I think they're getting conflated, is just we do have tough economic conditions out there, right? There's always a pressure for productivity and earnings and profitability. And so you've got that pressure. And I think you frankly have some leaders who don't really know any better. And they're like, okay, well, I got to cut costs. AI is going to let me cut costs. And you see all these stories of companies that let people go and then they're hiring them back. So anyway, it's hard to sort out, right? Nobody has a perfect crystal ball of how it's going to play out. But that's kind of what I'm seeing is like great PMs that are leaning into AI and vibe coding and using these tools are thriving, and people that are kind of avoiding it and like just saying this too shall pass are the ones that are going to end up on the sidelines, I think. The other last interesting dynamic is at my meetup, I've had, when I did my vibe coding hackathon and we have topics talking about AI, I've had multiple product leaders at the director or senior director level, even VP level say, Dan, you know what? I miss getting my hands dirty. I miss being an IC. I want to leave my director level job at this large company and I want to go be what we're calling this product creator, product builder role. They're like, I want to do that at a smaller company. I've heard that from multiple leaders, and it's fun because when you do vibe coding, this part of your brain fires off. Like you're like, oh my gosh, I'm actually creating something. You're a maker. You know what I mean? It just feels really good. And a lot of people really want that.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, obviously there's a lot to unpack there and probably won't be able to unpack all of it. But like,
yeah,
I think one of the things that interests me about this kind of like, because there was this kind of concept that kind of came up in the social media sphere around, I don't know, like super ICs and like,
yes.
Something along the lines of, people that were very senior leaders wanting to now just go back on the tools, like you say. And it kind of feels like, look, first of all, absolutely. Look, I was a developer for years. I know you were as well. Like, it's fun building stuff. I'm building stuff now. It's really cool. I enjoy doing it. I wish that I had some of the tools then that I have now. But it also feels that it kind of, to some extent, this narrative of like super ICs and like everyone's a builder now kind of does diminish a little bit the concept of, for example, strategy, good leadership, team building, all of these things that the more senior people were, having to do to try and make sure their companies are steering in the right direction, that they're making the right decisions, that they're de-risking things and not just building everything at the same time. So do you feel this kind of super IC, everyone's a builder, product engineer type narrative, which is starting to sort of appear in certain parts of the bubble, is to the detraction of basic good leadership? Or do you think it can kind of live alongside it?
I think it can live alongside it. And what I would say, I like this. So yeah, super IC was probably the first incarnation of the term. And now people are using the term product creator, product builder, or product. But just to be clear, like it's funny because I do think there's an element in what you're saying of truth, which is, oh my gosh, this is fun. This is fun.
Yeah, exactly. Like, fine. Great. Like fun's fun, right? But come on.
My time doing this because this is more fun than whatever else it is, right? So, but just because it's fun doesn't mean it's creating value for the business or the company per se. So I do think there's that little bit of temptation that could be there. To the extent that people are spending their time more on this as a fun activity, then yes, perhaps they're not spending on the other one. But I don't view it as an either or. And I view it as, again, I would just say, when it's so easy and quick to get to a solution or a robust prototype, it just elevates the importance of what should we be prototyping? What problem should we be solving? What is the real market opportunity? And also, what's the differentiation? If I can just build some, a decent tool with a set of prompts, then so can anybody else. So what's my real differentiation, right? So I do think, and I would just say, you mentioned strategy specifically. I routinely, when I give talks on product strategy, I ask the audience, who feels like your company has a solid product strategy? And it's always less than 10% of people raising their hands, right? Now, if the heads of product are in the room, the number goes up because they're like, yeah, we have a strategy. I made it the strategy. It's good. But most people don't have a strategy. So I would say and that's because it's not that it's not necessarily that it's not fun. It's just hard and it's difficult. And there isn't like an
It
approved
takes longer to
process.
pay off as well, right?
Yeah, no, totally. And that's the other thing is everybody has short-term fever. It's like, whoa, what are we launching this month? What are we launching this week? What are we launching this quarter? Right. And again, quarterly earnings and capital being a public company, you have that earnings pressure. So like it takes a really strong leadership and savvy leadership to say, no, we're actually going to take the time to plan more than 1 or 2 quarters ahead, and think about that. It's a luxury kind of unfortunately, for a lot of companies to do that. So I think they can coexist, this idea. I do think that there is a super IC idea. It actually predated, for what it's worth, it predated vibe coding. I used to call those people like what I would call when I saw a PM who had some tech chops, like you do, because they did either they invested in learning development or they did some coding. So like, I'm kind of technical, again, it was never the best use of their time to actually do coding, right? That's not the best use of their time. But by being technically savvy, they can partner more effectively with their engineers. And, not one is if the scopes don't make sense, they can question it. But what I've found is the most creative thing is oftentimes the first response from engineering, if you're technical, you can get under the hood with them and go, well, actually, we don't need this. What about this way? What about this? And next thing you know, you've got a much higher ROI solution that's less scope, right? So that's the idea. And then the other important skill set is design. And I've seen PMs that lean into design. Like for me, when I had my first PM job at Intuit, of course we did, discovery research. I wrote the best PRD I thought I could based on the research. And then we got in the product cycle and I realized, oh, wow, that we had to do all that. But if the UX design is bad, none of this really matters. So I made it a point to learn a lot about it. So anyway, I call PMs that have leaned into tech, tech learning and dev learning enough and UX learning enough. I used to call them triple threats. That's what I used to call them because it's like a sports player who can not only, rebound, they can make shots, they can pass or whatever. So I used to call them triple threats. So when I think of Super IC, that's what I think of. And I think with vibe coding, the bar has been lowered significantly. You don't have to be as technical. You don't even have to know as much about UX design, but it's that same mindset of opening your mind up to thinking about those things and trying to be aware of those things.
Yeah. And, again, it's, I guess like as with everything, it's all about balance, right? But just trying to make
Yes.
sure that, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a minute, that you're not just, just prioritizing execution over everything. And again, as like you say, because it's fun or because it's, it feels like it's
Right.
great to put things on a screen with your own hands after years and years of just doing like board reports and stuff like that. So I exactly as you put it, I completely get it. I just want to make sure that people are doing the rest of their job. Because actually, this is an interesting point, right? Like we're sitting there saying, I don't know, product managers, there was a lot of debate back and forth. Should they be technical? Obviously now, maybe they don't need to be as technical. They don't need to go and learn, like C# or whatever to start building stuff. They can start prompting away. But at the same time, like, why is it the engineering side that they have to go and vibe? Right? They could just legitimately be going and vibing sales type stuff or, commercial, marketing, go-to-market stuff or strategy stuff themselves. It shouldn't, it feels just like, maybe it's just the frustration that many PMs feel that they're not seen as builders, that they are kind of seen as kind of process people that kind of move stuff around and carry water. Like maybe engineering is just the fun part that's easier for them to get into. I don't know. It's just.
I don't think that's the motivation. I don't think it's an identity crisis of I want to be, viewed as a badass builder. I don't think that's what it is. I think what it is, and actually the way I couch it is when I give talks on this is, in my book and in my talks, the very last step, the second to last step of the lean product process, top of the product market fit pyramid is UX design. And so I'm a big fan of, hey, before we invest any engineering resources and code something, let's create a prototype that we can test with customers. And let's iterate on that until we get to the point where, customers love this thing. There's no complaints. Then we can very confidently go to engineering and say, build this because we validated it, right? That doesn't happen for a lot of reasons, right? So the thing is, and I have a slide. So I basically have a slide where I talk about what are the design artifacts a product team can create along the way, and they categorize them by fidelity and interactivity. The lowest one is a hand sketch, right? Hand sketch is great, whether it's on a whiteboard or a digital whiteboard or paper for the team to kind of get aligned. Then the next one up is wireframes, right? Like Balsamiq. I'm a big fan of Balsamiq. I think Balsamic's great because a lot of people rush to the colors and the pixels and the fonts before you've even thought about the layout and the information architecture. So by doing a wireframe, it forces you to answer those more fundamental questions. And you can actually test with a prototype, a wireframe. You can test, are we missing some key feature? Does the layout make sense? Does the flow make sense, right? And then the next thing, which is the most valuable and useful, is like a clickable or tappable mockups, basically, right? So like in the old days, we'd do InVision or something, And now, of course, Figma makes it super easy. So, a clickable Figma is it's high fidelity, it's clickable. It's like, it's real. That's where, and people hire me to apply my process. We use clickable Figmas to do it. And then finally, after that is the live product, which is the highest fidelity and activity. So, and the very next slide I show is, most people get that and they want to do that, but they're not doing it. And when you ask why, a lot of them have what I've called the design gap. And this is one of my oldest slides that I created from working with my very first product teams. I realized, gosh, like, they want to do this, but there's no one to create the prototypes, right? And again, when I'm in my audience and I ask people, I show this design gap. It has a maturity model where, like, the lowest maturity model is all you have is engineers, and then the next level up is you have engineers plus PMs, but no designers. And then the next level up is, well, maybe the engineer's a little UX savvy or the PM's a little UX savvy, and they can kind of close the gap a little bit, but they can't fully close it. And the next level up is, hey, between the two of them, they close the gap. And the final level is, of course, the trio, the triad we always talk about. Hey, it's PM, design, and engineering all working together, where the designer can step in and drive that prototyping, right? So again, when I ask people who here feels like they have adequate UX resources to do prototyping, it's less than 10% of people raise their hands, right? Even though design's a thing, it's appreciated, everybody understands it. It's just, your team may not get the designer. There might not be enough resources to go around. You might have open headcount. They might be out sick. Who knows why? So that's why I think vibe coding is so valuable, because now, whereas you previously would be blocked, it's like, well, I guess we can't prototype. Let's just write our user stories and have engineering code it. So you skip the whole testing and validation step because you couldn't create a prototype, And so now it unblocks product teams that used to be blocked, that you don't have to have a designer, you don't have to have someone technical. You can create a freaking pretty good prototype that you can test with some. So that's the way that's why I see it rising, is not any frustration with engineering per se. It's not any, I want to be a builder, I think that's cool per se. It's just, hey, I can more quickly get to a visual representation of the product, of the idea that we have in mind. And as I've worked on this, I've taught over 1,000 people now. I realize there's actually multiple audiences for the Vibe prototype. There's 4 distinct audiences. The first audience is actually yourself, because inevitably, no matter how good a job you did with discovery research, and no matter how good a job you did writing up your requirements, which turn into your prompt, you get the first prototype and you're like, oh, there's a table. Oh, I forgot to specify how it's sorted. They kind of sorted it in this weird way. It should really be sorted by date. So then you go back and you revise your requirements and say, okay, sort it by date. So you by getting the prototype, it helps you actually, I talk a lot about problem space, solution space. The prototype is solution space. But by seeing the prototype and reacting to it, you're going to be like, oh, I forgot these problem space requirements. And you're going to actually iterate on your own before you show that thing to anybody. You're going to iterate, 5 to 10, maybe 15 times to really answer all those questions that you didn't even think about, the unknown unknowns that you didn't think about. That's the first audience. The next audience is, now you can take it to your product team and you guys say, hey, here's what I'm thinking we could build, designer, what do you think? I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to do design for you. By definition, they kind of pick kind of a plain vanilla design or whatever. And so you could talk to them and the engineer could give you get feedback from them. Once they're happy with it, then that's great. The next audience is stakeholders, like senior stakeholders, right? And my insight here is like, you may have written a nice PRD. There's no way those senior stakeholders are taking time to read it. So you're trying to like share your ideas and concepts with them, which usually sadly means you're creating a Google slide deck of your PRD just for their consumption, right? So you have extra busy work to create another version of your PRD that they can consume. And even then you're using like text bullet points to explain something. Who knows if they're really grokking what you have in mind, if you have shared understanding. When you have a prototype you show to them, there certainly is shared understanding. That's very engaging. They engage with it. They go, what about this? What about this feature? What about this, right? So people can just engage in a better discussion. Like non-product trained people can react to a prototype and have a better discussion. And then, of course, the fourth audience, the most important, is users. Well, we can go and test this with customers to get their feedback. So I've found value in all 4 levels of those different audiences when you vibe prototype. Which again, if you go back to the old workflow, if you didn't have a designer, you couldn't do any of that. If you did have a designer, you would kind of write your user stories in PRD, and then you'd wait for the designer to come up with their initial design. They'd show it to you. You'd have some discussion with your team, and then you'd kind of go test it, right? So it's almost, in a sense, it's a richer process. It's more iterative, because each turn is so quick. Like each iteration is so fast. It's just you talking to the vibe coding tool. So that's how I've seen a lot of value for teams.
All right, well, let's dig into that then. I mean, obviously, you've gone through some of the use cases, and I'm sure there are many people thinking about additional use cases because, there are some people out there sitting there saying, oh, well, you kind of mentioned it earlier, we can just build any old thing and just one shot an app. You can make a new HubSpot just by typing
Right.
into some tool or something,
Yeah.
which, maybe we'll come back to that bit. But obviously, you're training a lot of this stuff at the moment, and I can think of a number of different ways that vibe coding, the actual process, like what it is you're actually doing, could be defined. So
Yeah.
I mean, you've talked about vibe coding, you've talked about vibe prototyping as well. Like, if we kind of think about vibe coding as a concept, like,
Yes.
how are you defining it specifically?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is we should get clear on who defined it, right? That's what's so funny is someone actually tried to argue with me on LinkedIn, like, well, vibe, they like put the definition of vibe from like Merriam-Webster dictionary because they were trying to, it's so funny because anytime you have a new term, people misinterpret it. They bring their own baggage to it, right? And so this person was feeling like, oh, it's not real coding. Vibe means it's loosey-goosey. And then I just kind of replied and said, well, yeah, cloud computing doesn't mean the servers are in the sky. Like you can't, like it says, but basically, I didn't create the term, right? The term was created by Andrej Karpathy, actually almost 1 year ago to the day. The other thing I love asking people is, hey, how long has vibe coding been around? And I'll do a poll. I'll be like 4 years, 3 years, 2 years, and it's less than a year. It's coming up. The 1 year anniversary is coming up on February 2nd. He said in a tweet, and he said there's a new kind of coding. I call it vibe coding. And what he said is where you fully give into the vibes, embrace exponentials, man, whatever that means, and forget that the code even exists, right? So I think it's, but the point is that last part, forget the code even exists, right? So vibe coding for me means basically you're generating code without like actively coding. Like you don't have to write before vibe coding, you have to type every character. Yeah. Maybe there was autocomplete in your IDE or something that could accelerate a little bit, right? But the point is, it's the AI. So it's Gen AI, and it's Gen AI for code, right? Gen AI is generational AI, it's generating that stuff for you, right? So that's the idea. And when I got into this, and again, I really appreciate it because I do have that. It's funny because I spent time way back a long time ago after my third web product. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to learn how to code this web stack stuff because I like to know, right? And then I used it for a few years, and then I just sat in the back shelf in my brain, and I haven't used it really that much. And then I also learned a lot about UX design. Now with vibe coding, you get to use all that stuff, so when I got into it, I'm like, oh, there's so many different tools here. I wonder if anybody's kind of sorted them out, and nobody had. And as you know from my book and other stuff, I'm a frameworks guy. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to create a framework for how to understand these vibe codes. So I have a framework called the vibe coding spectrum. And the main thing is it goes from less technical on the left to more technical on the right. And part of the problem, like same thing, with MVP is when you have one umbrella term that spans so many different categories, of course, people are going to misinterpret it, and they're going to say, and it's for this category, not this one. Other people go, no, it's this category, not this one, right? So anyway, it's a spectrum, and there's 6 categories basically going from less technical to more technical. And I actually, in the chart, it has a lot of things. It has like, what's the UI? So the less technical ones are browser based. You just run it in a browser. There's no installation required, right? There's no app or anything like that. And then from there, it progresses up to, an extension for Visual Studio Code. Then it gets to a standalone IDE desktop app, and then it gets to command line. That's kind of the progression of like the technical stuff. And then I also talk about the roles. The ones on the right end, the more technical, obviously the sweet spot target user for those is developers, right? And I would kind of reserve vibe coding if I had to, split hairs. I'd be like, hey, vibe coding is the right side, and the left side that's more targeted at PMs and designers, I would call that vibe prototyping. And in the middle between the 2 categories, there's a big shift. When you use any of the tools on the left half of the spectrum, the default UI is, when you're in the tool, is the actual UI of what you're vibe prototyping. That's what you like. The code is there. You can switch to a code view, but it doesn't show you that. So like literally you could vibe code a product and never have to look at the code. That's kind of the cool thing about it. On the right side, the default view is the code. You can, of course, look at the UI. You might have to launch a local host in a browser, or maybe they have a separate browser view or something, right? And over time, these 2 categories are starting to merge a little bit. But that's a fundamental thing. It just tells you right there, the default view is either the UI you're creating or the default view is the code you're creating, right? So that's the idea. And, really quick, and on the far left, it's not so much that they're less technical. It's just that there's a category of tools that are really optimizing for things that designers would care about. Like if you do want to replicate your look and feel, you have a design system. You want to integrate with Figma, right? Then those tools kind of live there. So Figma Make is obviously in that category. Designers love Figma. And so a lot of them, Figma Make is right there. So they use that. A very popular, another one, it's a smaller startup, but they're getting a lot of traction. It's called Magic Patterns. And so I've used them at a lot of my hackathons. And so that's another example of a designer friendly one. The next category up is and anybody can use any tool, right? So I kind of show these bands of ideal user as gradients and fades. I think the next is kind of more PM centric, is like Lovable and Bolt, right? And Base 44 and so things like that. And it's basically, Lovable's got a lot of traction. I think they have a great brand name. They have a great logo. It's, they really, I've been, using these tools since the spring, and it's incredible to see what they're doing. So but they're all kind of, you can go in and you can create your tool. It's pretty straightforward. And then, so that's that's the starting point. If you're a designer, start with Magic Patterns, Figma Make. If you're a PM, start with Lovable Bolt. And then if you're like, this is I want to do more. I'm more technical than this. Then it's natural for people to migrate up the spectrum over time. They move to the right. They might graduate to Replit and go, okay, like, for example, this model predicts things like the GitHub integration. In Lovable and Bolt, they actually have their own version history, so you don't even need to use GitHub. But if you want to move your code around, it can be problematic. But their GitHub implementation is very limiting. Whereas in Replit, it gives you a kind of full control of what you can do. You can do more backend stuff, things like that. So it's natural for people to maybe start with a Lovable or Bolt and then move up to a Replit or V0, right? And then I think if you're a developer, if you're very comfortable in Visual Studio Code, then hey, try one of the IDE extensions out, like GitHub Copilot, Codex, Gemini, or Cursor is very popular. So I think that those are some good entry points. And if you're like, hey, I don't need any UI, then just go straight to Cloud Code. If you like command line and that's your cup of tea, then you can go there. So that's pretty much it. Just jump in at the lower end and you can move up over time. As you run into a constraint, I'm trying to do X, but it won't let me. You can go Google and be like, hey, does this other tool let me do it? You'll usually find that there are, fewer constraints and more things that you can do as you move up to the right.
So the long and short of it is that you pick whichever one of those tools, suits you the best, as you kind of just described. You put some kind of, natural language specification or description of what you want to come out the other end. It goes off and does it. And it's either in Lovable and it's all wrapped up in its own little box, or it's just one step before that, it's a prototype, or all the way through to some full zip file of React application that you can put up onto a server somewhere. But ultimately, you've got some kind of app that's come out of the back of it. That's the
well,
kind
they
of the
actually, just to be clear, there's no zip file. Like they actually deploy it. So that's what's cool is it's all
in
end-to-end.
Lovable and such.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
no, I'm talking about more like on the code side, for example.
That gets into a fundamental thing that as you get into there's like a Grand Canyon in the middle of this spectrum that's invisible. Let's call it the chasm, right? The vibe coding chasm, right? Which is you're like, I've seen, and this is where you see the haters on LinkedIn. They like, the people the coders that have the code base, and they're like, okay, that's great that you created that lovable prototype on its own island in isolation. But now if you want to get this into the code base, it's got to live in our code. But every once in a while you'll see some technical person poking fun and saying, yeah, you can't ship that lovable stuff. And people like to throw up the security flags and whatever flags and all this jazz, right? But again, going back to my use case, I think the fallacy is why there's value in just rapid prototyping. There's value in just using it for rapid prototyping, especially if you didn't have a designer who could have done it for you anyway. So I think, people are missing that aspect of it. Now, as people get more advanced and they're more savvy, like I see this in my workshop all the time, they'll do, and by the way, real quick, we should talk about no one's one-shotting anything good, right? The first time you do vibe coding, you're like, build an Airbnb clone, and it spins and it does it. And you're like, check it out. And but what you just built is not going to compete with Airbnb, right? So what's funny is over time, people are, instead of talking about prompt engineering, they're talking about context engineering, the importance of context. So it's kind of funny because before vibe coding, PRDs were kind of becoming less and less fashionable. It was like, oh, we don't do that. It was shorter. Da, 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 da. And now people realizing, yeah, my main takeaway is anything you leave to chance, anything you leave unspecified, the tool is going to have to make a guess out of the N thousand possibilities. The odds that it's going to guess a great one that a smart human would have picked are pretty low. So I call this like degrees of freedom. If you leave any degree of freedom in there, it's going to like take a guess. And, then you'll get in there and you'll be like, oh yeah, no, this really shouldn't be a table. This should be this, and then you go in and you start to do it. Right. So that's the first thing I want to say is like, you've got to actually, provide a lot of context to these things in order to get value, out of them. And, when I run my workshops, the PMs they'll do I'll have a little like vibe coding template that provides the context, and I try to be short with bullet points. And then they get it. And then inevitably, when I run my private workshops, after 10 minutes, the first PM or designer goes, oh, this is cool, but this isn't actually our brand colors. I'm like, you didn't think of that before, did you? Then it's fine because I want them to discover it by touching the hot stove. And so then they go, oh yeah, so that's the perfect example. It's like, okay, well now let's get our style guide. Let's have it replicate. It's super easy for it to replicate your style guide. That's an example of how can we reduce the differential for if we did want to take this vibe prototype thing and try to get it into our production code base. In coding terms, we call it a diff. Like, what's the difference in the code, right? How can we minimize that merged diff? So that's one example. The next example, if you keep thinking is, well, we've got these components, we've got these UI components. Why are we just building random stuff with a vibe coding tool, building whatever it is? Why don't we just reuse our existing components? Well, a lot of times it's teams are not at that level of sophistication. They haven't got components. They haven't got it in a format. But the teams that do, that's, for example, like Magic Patterns, that you have your component library so that you're actually starting with your actual component. So you're seeing people coming up with ways to cross that chasm, right? But even if you don't, I think there's tons of value in just rapid prototyping, because even if it's like, okay, yeah, worst case, they're going to have to completely figure out how to write this in the code base. You validated the product idea. It's valid, right? So that's where you get into the other thing. If you start on the left by prototyping, you're starting from scratch with a blank slate. Yes, let's be smart about, using our existing styles and things like that. When you start on the right side, it's by definition, like we have a code base. We know whatever we're building is going to have to get integrated. And so it's within that context that you are creating new things, right? So over time, obviously be great for things to be truly end to end. And the people on the left are trying to go down the spectrum. So like, Cursor launched a new browser thing where you can actually drag and drop UI layout and make visual changes, which, wasn't there on that side of the spectrum before. Lovable is, doing other things like they have a separation between production and test environments. And so they're all everybody wants that ultimate thing of, without knowing anything about the code base, I can create new stuff that's really easy to merge in. That's the holy grail if we can get there, and people are trying to get there. But again, there's huge value in the ability to rapid prototype and test stuff, even if there's, it doesn't necessarily decrease the coding burden by a whole lot.
I guess though, I mean, you talked about the kind of the tech haters and stuff, and obviously there's some that are way out there, and then the complete advocates on the other side as well. But there is the potential risk when everything feels so easy, like you say, like you put some prompt in, it comes out and it looks amazing, and you think it's all going to work, and maybe even put the right colors in, and it all looks like it's just going to hook. You just hook it straight in, right? You can just send it straight to the development team, and off you go to the races. Like it's basically done, right? And obviously the developers that need to kind of integrate this stuff, they know that that's not the case, and they probably use AI to do some of it. But there's maybe this danger that things become so easy that people that don't know that there is still some, we know there's complexity around it, but people that don't know that are now expecting that all of a sudden we can just bang everything straight into the product. Like, is that a risk?
It definitely is. No, I think senior stakeholders, let's pick on our friends in sales. They say, this is awesome, ship it. And they don't really understand all that's required, and that this is a separate this isn't our code. This is a separate standalone throwaway code thing. It's a rapid prototype. They don't get it. Or even senior stakeholders, right? Your C-level people, your VP level people that aren't technical, that don't really understand. They don't understand the effort, right? And what's involved. So there's definitely that risk. And actually, it's kind of sad. I think I was talking to someone, even some PMs that are not technical fall into that trap. They are talking, they're going to the engineering counterparts and going, hey, why can't you just take this and launch it? Like, and it's like, it's like, oh my gosh, are you serious? Like, let's go through all the reasons why we can't just, even if we wanted to, like, it's not integrated with our auth, it's not integrated with our database, like, so, but if somebody doesn't know all that stuff, it can definitely have, mismatches and expectations of, well, it's there, just go launch it, build it and launch it. So I think I do think that's a risk. And it's not like everyone's suddenly magically going to understand the tech effort required. So it's going to be a conversation, right? And yeah, so. But that being said, vibe coding on the right, it does make engineers more productive. Like they can, generate code. It is creating a new problem, which is a large amount of pull requests and having to review a lot of changes. So even if you're using, these tools that the engineers are busier with that. So now people are creating AI tools to make that more efficient. But that is a new thing. As more and more lines of code are generated, then the diffs are bigger and the pull requests are bigger, right?
Well, that's an interesting point, though, because again, you know coding, I know coding. We can both build stuff if we wanted to with our hands. I don't imagine we would be doing that these days because, again,
Right.
who's got the time, right? But also, there are so many ways to use this stuff to accelerate, even if you are a good coder. But then, if we look under the hood at what's been produced by, you said earlier, like, oh, you don't need to know that there's any code there at all.
Right.
But obviously, there is
Right.
some code there. And you
Yes.
look under the hood and you're like, well, actually, that's just a bunch of spaghetti, or it keeps building new stuff, reusing stuff all over the place, security holes, potential kind of attack vectors that have been introduced because it kind of just went the wrong way. Now, obviously, again, from a vibe perspective, you just sit there and go, well, it works, it looks kind of good. But from a technical perspective, people are sitting there saying, well, you can't put this stuff out there. Like there's a joke about like in 2-3 years, the hottest job is going to be getting proper engineers who can come and fix all of the vibe coded code. But it is a narrative out there that like, sure, do what you want for prototypes and kind of quick checks and doing some of the stuff you talked about, but never put this stuff live is what some people are saying. Do you think there's something to that, or do you think?
The funny thing is people know, right? They know that people on the left end of the spectrum know that's the criticisms. And so that's why like they have security reviews and checks. And so like the biggest thing is they are listening to market feedback and they're acting on it. So they're not trying to be like, no, there's no security risk. In the interest of expediency, like it would basically like save your secret keys in some text file or something in the early days. And then as people realize these are bad patterns, now the tools don't do those bad patterns anymore. They just don't do it. Like now they've created a separate, secure place where your secrets go, like all this jazz. And they have a security center. So, is that gonna like fully get you to enterprise grade security? I don't know, but they're trying to at least address the main issues, right? The flip side, I will say, is there's a whole other audience. I know most of our audience are product people and product teams inside of companies, but there's a whole other audience, which is the solopreneur audience. And actually, maybe a PM who's working in a company and this is their side hustle. I mean, there are people launching businesses on Lovable and these other tools. They're deployed. They're making money. Some people are making, 5 figures for sure. I'm sure a few are making 6 figures. It's just a matter of time before we, hear about the solo coded, vibe coded business that got a
First
billion or
unicorn.
whatever. Yeah, right. It's just a matter of time because you really can. So again, it's easy for haters to be like poke holes at stuff, but at the end of the day, the other thing is they're getting better and better. And one of the hacks in the earlier days, you don't have to do it as much, is this is also like when you would get stuck, if you're trying to make a change and you're just kind of going around what I call the debug death loop, or just the vibe coding death loop, where it just doesn't get what you want. It's not making the change. You take your code to a different tool and you get a second opinion. It's like a doctor getting a second opinion. It can often solve the problem that the other one didn't. And it can also, you can be like, hey, analyze this for security holes. Like Claude Code, go analyze this for security holes, right? So, or you can be like, hey, go refactor this. Like, I think part of the best practices is you every once in a while you stop and you say, okay, we've been coding for a while. Analyze the code. What's inefficient? What's not necessary? And it'll go and so part of it. That's what's funny is, in a sense, you don't need to be technical in the sense of knowing how things work, but you do kind of need a little mini architect, mini engineering manager hat to be like, well, let's just, how are we, it helps. I think it helps a little bit to kind of, I don't know, to kind of, but the tools are getting better and better, where a lot of that is just getting automated under the hood that you don't need to know about or worry about too much.
Yeah, it reminds me of the thing I saw recently. There's some automation script or something called Ralph Wiggum, which basically just takes, like, you give it a task and you tell it what success looks like, and it goes off and tries to do it. And if it fails, it just tries again, and it just tries again. Like, the slow-witted but kind-hearted,
I see.
Simpsons cartoon character, and it just
Yeah,
keeps
yeah.
going and going and going and going and going
Yeah.
until eventually something comes out the other end that kind of passes all your tests. But that does then speak to exactly what you say of, like, you need to be able to define the end state. You need to define the boundaries and what you want to happen. Even if you don't know how to make it happen, you need to kind of understand how that might happen. Which is
Right.
interesting, because it kind of feels like the people that maybe get the most benefit out of, for example, the vibe coding stuff, and they can just go and prompt and it can go off and do it, maybe you're not going to develop that because they didn't ever work in that kind of area, and they almost
Yeah.
need more support. Like, so are there tools that you recommend people use to try and maybe even help them with architectural choices, or design patterns that they could use? Because otherwise, if you just got, like you said earlier, like, they'll just go and type, make me a CRM, and it'll just
Right.
go and pick loads of
Right.
stuff off the shelf itself, and maybe that's not the right ones.
Right. Well, I think that brings up a few really important points. One is, again, I said that when you give it a prompt, it's basically gonna it's gonna make all these decisions for you that you didn't even think about, right? And so one of those examples would be layout. And so you're like, make me an app like this, and then you get a layout. And if so the interesting
Looks
thing
like all
is,
the other apps. Looks like all
no,
the
no,
other apps.
well, who knows? Yeah, it looks like it, like all the other apps, or all the other apps. Let's say there's like 4 or 5 different ways that they look. It's going to look like one of those 4 or 5, and maybe it picks the one that's the worst out of those 4 or 5, right? So the interesting thing is, it goes against another best practice, which is divergent thinking. Like, when you do design properly, you don't explore 100 different directions, but you say, oh, well, we could do it this way. We could do it with 2 columns. We could have a list. We could have a map. Like, you kind of play around with, you do a little divergent thinking, right? Well, most vibe coding tools, you just get one solution instance or iteration. That's what you get. And if so, it's kind of like a random roll of the dice. You might end up in a part of the 3D topology where you're going to be like at a local maxima, and there's only so much you can do. If you're not UX design enough savvy to realize that, oh, this kind of isn't the best layout or whatever, you're going to keep going down that path, optimizing, right? So that's why, again, I think it's good what people realizing that people are really good. They'll do divergent thinking. They'll put the same prompt even in the same tool, because these are non-deterministic tools. If you give Lovable the same prompt 4 times, you will get different, at least slight variations, maybe more, or you might put it in a different tool like Magic Patterns or Bolt or Cloud Code and see what they come up with, right? And so that's interesting. And that's actually one of the things that Magic Patterns has, again, that reinforces that it's kind of designer centric, is it will actually, kind of like Midjourney would do, it'll give you 4 designs. It'll give you 4 high level designs, and then you can kind of, oh, okay, I like this one. And then you can pick a direction to go down. So I think that's something that's really important. And I think that, again, it just highlights the importance of having some UX design savvy. You don't need to be super detailed, but just knowing, like, hey, like, there could be different layouts, there could be different flows here. How do we want to do that, right? So that's I think an important thing. The other thing that's really valuable is, and this is kind of an interesting concept that lives somewhere between technical and somewhere between UX design, but I think more within UX design, is in my vibe coding template, I added a section that I normally would not have PMs think about this early, which is, what's the object model? And I'm not talking about the database table designs, but it's kind of like at a high level, hey, we've got regions and we've got stores and we've got employees and we've got products and we've got SKUs. Like, what is that entity relationship, high level entity relationship diagram of the objects or the data? Because again, if you don't specify that, it's going to take a stab in the dark and it's probably not going to get it right. Right. So that's why I add, like, that's like a pseudo UX thing where you got to think about. So it is interesting that to get the best outcomes, you do gotta stick your toe into the solution space a little bit and start to think about, what I mean, and have an opinion about stuff. Otherwise, you're gonna get kind of random stuff. So that's another aspect that I found people is helpful for people.
But one narrative that I have seen, again, if you go on places like X and stuff these days as well, a lot of people talking about it, there's almost this kind of vibe in some quarters. And you touched on it a bit earlier about kind of PRDs being in and out of fashion and such.
Yeah.
And obviously you can even use AI to create the PRDs these days as well. But this idea of, like, waterfall is back, baby. It's like, we need to kind of specify it all up front. You touched on the fact you need to provide a bunch of context, and you need to make sure that you don't let it make assumptions. But at the same time, there's almost this push from some quarters to say, okay, well, actually, we need to kind of over-specify everything again, because that's the way to get the best results. Now, from my perspective, having done a lot of work in this area myself on my own side projects, you sit there and you think, well, actually, these things can still iterate, right? Like, yeah, sure, you're not going to be able to just put like a few lines in and get a perfect result. You're not going to one-shot a CRM like we talked about already. But at the same time, you can give it that, get it to do that first pass and then look at it and say, oh, okay, actually, I maybe want to do these things. And then you can iterate within the tools as well, right? So it feels a little bit premature to sit there and say, oh, well, waterfall's back. We've got to over-specify everything, the revenge of the PRD. Because for me, like, iterating with these things is like the biggest part of the fun, right? Like, do you see it that way, or do you think that there
I think that
more of a bias towards the specification?
I don't think it's waterfalls back. I think people are realizing that if I spend 5 seconds thinking about what I type in for a prompt versus spending 5 minutes, I'm going to get better output for 5 minutes, right? It's just garbage in, garbage out. It's basically that, right? And I think it's not like the more specification, the better. I think that's like a Goldilocks thing. If you provide too little context, it's going to just guess. It's going to guess a bunch of stuff and it's going to guess wrong. And the question is, are you going to detect it? Are you going to realize, oh, this layout really isn't the best or not? Are you going to keep going down that path, right? And that's the other thing is, I actually think these things accelerate iteration. So I think that, yes, you want to start with a solid opinion or hypothesis, and that's why I have this vibe coding template, like, who's our customer? Like, it answers all the key questions. So at least hopefully starting at the best point. Again, I think of like a 3D surface, like typical like local maxima, global maxima kind of stuff. And it's like, where are we starting? We want to start with a solid foundation, and then we're definitely going to iterate, because like I said, the first audience is you. You're going to realize, oh, I forgot to specify these 5 things in the PRD. So then I would call that iterating. We're iterating. We're learning that. And then we go back and we revise the PRD. The other thing is, what's really important is to have the judgment to be like, okay, I've been working, we landed in a certain spot on this 3D graph, and I've been working and trying to basically the higher up you get, the better, the better it is. And I've been working on this, but I just realized, oh man, like, you can only change direction so much. You're better off starting over again sometimes. And it's judgment to know. And I like to, joke from Aliens, the nuke from orbit and start over. Like, nuke from orbit, just nuke it all. Because once you realize it's super easy, these are like tissue papers. Like, generating a new prototype. There's no like, oh my gosh, this is the one that I've been working on. It's like, now you've learned so much. You can recreate it again with what you know now and start at a better foundation. You know what I mean? So that's the trick, is you can get these things to course correct, 10, 15 degrees. But if you suddenly realize, oh man, we had the whole wrong model, or we forgot this one key feature, you're probably better off just adding. And actually, I saw this, just to share a very specific example. I was doing a private workshop, and it was a CPTO. So she had both engineering and product and design under her. And so the engineers were there. And so as a result, most of the teams wrote really good PRDs, like thoughtful, detailed, and again, getting into the solution space a bit so that they would get the right output. And this one team, they put their PRD in, their first shot PRD in, and they got a tool and it looked pretty good. But as they were clicking around, they realized a couple of things that they had missed or forgot. They decided to nuke from orbit. They went back, they added those things to PRD. And the second shot, they're like, this is amazing. And it was amazing. It actually did like 4 levels deep. But what I mean by that is, like, there was a dashboard page. You click on a doctor, and then it went to the doctor page and it listed their patient. You click on a patient and it went to their sessions that they had. And then, so it was just, and it did that, what I call a 4D. If you think of like a sitemap, it was 4 deep just from a really thoughtful PRD. So, but the flip side is, you can over specify. And that's what people are realizing too, is like, it's not like a book report back from grade school. Like, how thick is it? How much does it weigh? It's like, it's got to be valuable information. And if there's too much context, these things have limited memory and context windows. It'll like forget. By the time it's on page 80 of your long doc, it's forgotten what's on page 1, right? And so that's the other thing. There's another thing, which is more of a PM thing, a little bit of an engineering thing, is like, okay, I've got this complex application that's probably going to span like 6 to 8 features and have like 20 pages. should I try to do the whole thing all at once from the beginning? Or should I like focus on first off the global nav and like the first module? And so there's this scope management of how do I break this into bite-sized pieces that you also learn by doing, right? And that's why I really think it's important to get your hands dirty, because you learn by doing. You realize, oh, I tried. And a perfect example, first time I prototype anything, I basically stuck to the front end and I iterated, and it was great. Second time, I'm like, okay, let's go full stack this time. So I'm gonna go full stack from the get-go. And I was like, you know what? I was really excited because I'm like, I'm going to add Google Auth. You know how all the websites have Google Auth? I'm like, cool. I don't have to code it. I can vibe code it. Well, after 30 minutes of debugging the darn thing, I'm like, why am I wasting 30 minutes debugging Google Auth? That has nothing to do with the value proposition of the actual app that I am testing. If I had a rapid prototyping mindset, I'd be like, who cares? Like, just fake it. You click a button and you auth. Like, that's the MVP kind of thing, right? And so, and same thing. Once you add that database and that backend, now you have technical constraint. The technical debt counter just started, and if you want to make changes, now it's more complicated. Next thing you know, you're debugging backend stuff again that doesn't really matter. So I kind of, after trying both of those, my mantra now is focus on the front end as long as possible. Put off auth and backend database integrations as long as possible. Fake it till you need it, right? Get some sample data in a CSV file. I love using like browser local storage as a hack for having a database, all that jazz. So it's all these kind of things so that it's really about speed of iteration and quickly getting to, going back and forth between solution space and problem space till you really get to something that people really like. And then we can say, great, now how are we going to implement this thing in our back end and things like that?
We could talk about this for hours, but I think there's a very important question that people maybe that have started listening to this and, started thinking about this and been like,
yeah,
okay, that all sounds great, Dan, but like you've kind of touched on already, there's so many different options, there's so many different things that people could do. If someone wants to get started with this stuff, like you and I have both got started with it, we know we've probably got our own, half a dozen side projects that we're already working on the side.
Right.
Someone's sort of coming into this, maybe they're a bit of a holdout, or they've been told they can't do it, or they've now been pushed to start doing it. Like, where do they get, you talked about Lovable. Is it just Lovable, or is there some kind of concrete first step you sort of think they should be taking to get going?
One is what tool to start with. I would just recommend Lovable as a default, right? And then the second thing is like, hold on a second. I'll just share this URL with people. It's fine. It's like, I created this. So it's just bit.ly/vibebrief, VIBEBRIEF. It's a simple, lightweight, like PRD for vibe coding that people can fill out. And so I think that, again, it's kind of like PM. You learn best by doing it on the job, by doing it, right? And so I think, and for example, I have someone, I'm teaching a workshop this weekend, and she's a PM doing it for the first time. She's going to create a personal website. Like, you don't need WordPress or any of this jazz anymore. It's just like you can create a really slick looking, and you can get all these JavaScript animations and all this cool stuff without knowing any of the code. So I would say as a default fallback, if you're like, I want to do vibe coding, I don't have a project in mind, then just create a, even if you have an existing website, create a V2 website and see what you can do. That's a simple thing you can do. I do think a lot of people, what's funny is when I ran my hackathon, so in July, I ran a hackathon with over 250 people. Most people created their own app for their own use case. Like, one person collected stamps. So like, I want to create a stamp collecting app the way I like to. Someone else, like, I want to track my nutrition the way I want to. So it's kind of like the iOS Apple stores. Like, there's an app for that. Well, now it's like everybody can create. You're like how you do to-dos, you create your to-do app, right? Like, and my daughter, who's 14, went to it and she created two apps. One was to track her money and her finances, and the other was to track recipes because she likes to cook and bake. And so, so that's the other thing I would recommend is think of some side project or something, even not for money, but just your personal passion. Like, I'm into nutrition, right? And I have a certain way I like to think about the macronutrients that I think is like a good visualization. Like, if I had some spare time, that's what I would kind of play around with vibe coding, right? Something like that. So yeah, so that's the idea. I think you just try Lovable. All these tools, by the way, have free tiers, and you're probably not going to hit the paywall. If you do, you're probably going to be glad that you did, because it means you're making really good progress. And and they've all added rollovers. It's gotten very consumer friendly. The rollovers and all this other, you can just pay as you go. You can just buy as you go. No one's trying to lock you in any long-term contract. But I think my mantra after doing so many vibe coding things this is what's funny, Jason, is they've got the tool set up. They fill out my vibe coding brief template, and they're sitting there staring at the empty box with their cursor blinking, and they're just like a deer in headlights. I'm like, copy, paste, go. Like I've had, like, that's the first speed bump or hurdle. Like it's just a mental thing. They're like, is this, and it comes from the old school, like, perfectionism. Like, is this right? Is this going to do the right? It's like, you have to understand, this is not about perfection. Just jump in and go, and you'll change it. You're going to iterate. If you realize it was all junk, then to start over again, right? So I just quote to everybody for vibe coding. My top piece of advice is the Nike slogan: just do it. Just do it. Just jump in and do it. Get your hands dirty. There's plenty of people that haven't started yet. And so it's not too late to start learning today.
But there are some people out there that might be sitting there saying, that sounds fantastic. I'm definitely going to try and do that. But there's organizational inertia within whichever, maybe they work in a bank or something. Maybe they've been told explicitly not to go and do that because,
right.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they can't stop people doing stuff for side projects, but like if they wanted to start kind of bringing this into their actual day-to-day work, like, have you seen any kind of tactics or approaches you can use to persuade skeptical people in maybe slightly laggardly businesses to, maybe start letting you experiment with around the sides? Or are there some times you just have to kind of give up and just kind of stick to your side projects?
Well, one, I would say if you're in an environment where you can't do it in your work, then definitely do it on the side. And I would advocate even maybe do it on the side, because you can just, you might even have more motivation for your own personal projects to do stuff. And it's kind of fun and you'll learn by doing, which is fun. Inside a company, I think the number one thing is to make sure that people understand, like, what'll happen is typical big company stuff. Somebody like, security, security, And so the first thing you have to say is, no, none of this is going into our code base. None of this is getting deployed. This is just a prototype. The Figma things we used to do? This is just that. So that people understand that it's just like a substitute for a Figma, clickable Figma. That's all it is, really, right? So that's it. And then typical change management is like, hey, can we pilot this on one team and see how it goes? And I think that, the team will find that they will be able to iterate more quickly and get customer feedback more quickly. And stakeholders will like it. I mean, as soon as stakeholders start seeing these robust prototypes instead of some boring PRD or something that they're not going to read, they're going to want it too, right? And then the problem there is then they can start, telling you that they can start giving you modifications to the thing that are all, we're back to solution space. Well, and that's another aside is, I've had more than one product leader say, I want us to do vibe prototyping so we can go and talk to engineering and be like, look, it didn't, why are these things taking so long? To kind of in a respectful way, challenge.
There be dragons.
Yeah, not in the coding, but just like, and it's funny because sometimes, you are able to do things that people, seem faster, like would take longer or something like that. So it's just interesting. It's interesting. If nothing else, it's a way to get people to and aligned on a product idea much more quickly, right?
Well, we could all do with a bit of that. Now, you've got this book here that's been around for some time now.
Yes.
You're talking about your framework that you now have for vibe coding. So are we to expect a vibe coding book from Dan Olsen soon at some point?
It's interesting. I've seen some AI books come out. The sad thing is, speaking of waterfall, the publishing industry is very waterfall. I've seen AI books come out, and then it was before Gemini even came out, and now the whole book is kind of irrelevant. I think, and I'm a love books. I listened to over 100 books on Audible last year. I wrote a book. I love learning education books, and I'm hesitant to ever say, I don't know if I'd write a book on that topic. But AI just feels like such a fast-moving topic that I feel like most books would be out of date by the time they get printed. So I don't think I would write a book on it. That's why I focus on the workshops. That's the cool thing, is actually doing a workshop every 2 or 3 weeks. I see the changes in the tools. I see the new features they're adding every 2 or 3 weeks. I get the release notes and the updates, but then I see it. Actually, in one workshop we were using Lovable, in the middle of the workshop, the UI changed, the button name changed. I'm like, they just launched something while we were doing this, right? So I think that's the way. I think with AI, you just have to use. And look, we're all busy, so you have to figure out how to do that, how to figure out which things are worth investing in, because you can't learn a bazillion different tools, obviously. So, but you do need to spend a little bit of your learning budget and time, just your time, on on those tools, right? And so one way I stay on top of it is with email newsletters that cover AI. And so a lot of people ask me, which ones do I read? So I'll just give them real quick. The Rundown AI is one, Superhuman AI is another one, and Pivot 5 is a third. And every morning I just read those to see what's going on, because it's changing so fast.
Well, fair enough, but I'll still keep my eyes open just in case. But if
I'm not saying I wouldn't write another book. It just wouldn't be about AI. I do hope to write another book one day. But
nutrition, you can do one about nutrition.
Oh, well, I thought about it would be a whole other thing, but I thought about it. I've geeked out a lot on it, but maybe create an app on it. We'll see. But speaking of AI, for all the people that have managed to stick to this point, I have a joke for them. You ready, Jay?
Let's do it. As long as it wasn't written by AI, because, come on.
No, it wasn't. So, and we're talking about, some people are leaning into AI. Some other people are scared of it. What do you call someone who's afraid of AI?
I mean, let's, for the sake of argument, say I don't know. What do you call someone who's afraid of AI?
Claustrophobic.
I knew it was coming. But
hey, I'm a dad. I got to do dad jokes, man.
Well, yeah. Well, I've met your kids. I'm already feeling sorry for them again.
Aww.
It's funny though, because claustrophobic now, they'd probably have to rebrand, because of the trademark thing from
I saw the Claudebot.
So,
Claudebot had to do it. Yeah.
Everyone's up in arms that apparently the fundamentals of trademark law are now up for debate. But claustrophobic, I think, we can take that. Well, if people are feeling claustrophobic and they want to come and find you and, learn a bit more, or, sort of tap you up for some resources, or just generally catch up and see how all this stuff works, where can they come and find you after this?
Well, my website is my name, Dan-Olsen, OLSEN.com. That has links to everything else. I do have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/Dan Olsen, where my talks are there. So my vibe coding talks are there. Of course, all my product management talks are there. But the other thing, there are way more talks from my speakers that I've hosted at Lean Product Meetup. For 15 years, I've been hosting a speaker every month. So like Marty Kagan's on there 7 or 8 times. And I have a lot of AI speakers lately and vibe coding speakers. So that's a good resource. And of course, obviously I'm on LinkedIn. So
no one will find you there, because that's the last place you can find anyone these days.
Oh, but, heaven forbid you have an external link anywhere, right? It's so funny because it used to be like link in first comment, and now they're hiding the first comment. Like they default to most relevant, where for some reason, if there's only one comment that links externally, it's not relevant. I don't know.
This is a whole different podcast episode.
Yes.
We'll be complaining about that. But I'll link all that into the show notes, and hopefully some people will come and feel some good vibes and try and work out what they can do next. But, Dan, obviously it's always a pleasure to chat. Always fascinating to dig into what you're working on. And obviously, it's been fun, kind of batting some of this stuff back and forward. But as for now, all I can do is thank you for taking the time.
Jason, thanks so much, man. It's great chatting with you about this stuff, and I hope it's helpful for people.